Welcome to the Kugelmugel, the planet's only 100% spherical republic. Many years ago, in the long-lost era of 1971, a man constructed a Mugel. A Kugelmugel, to be precise. That doesn't sound as fun in English. A circular mound? That doesn't even rhyme. But luckily, this happened in Austria, so I'm going to stick with the German. This is a story that begins at conception. Well, the Mugel's conception when it was being built upon a Wiese. That means a meadow. Although I prefer to use the word Anger because it's almost the same thing, and it looks like the English word anger, which is exactly what building this Mugel inspired. Okay, that's enough German. The reason for the anger was that the meadow it was built upon was public land, and the man building it had no permission from anyone but himself. Even if he did own the land, or had filed the proper paperwork, which he hadn't, for whatever reason, circular structures couldn't be built as residences in that part of Austria. Which seems a little arbitrary, so I can understand why the man might have been a bit annoyed. But even more than that, I can understand why the local people might have been annoyed, because the land he was breaking these rules on wasn't his, and only he and he alone had decided that was okay. Well, okay, also his son had decided that, but I have a feeling there was a bit of a bias there. According to that maker, this was his right as an artist, or perhaps even more so, as a human being. He'd even go so far as to call it anarchismus, which in English translates to, I suppose, doing whatever he wanted with nobody being allowed to stop him. If anyone ever tried, or for that matter acted towards him as he'd been acting towards them, he would call them fascists. But while there are many countries on this planet where a little act of ironic individualism might have gone unnoticed, none of them are named Austria. In a country where every blade of grass is managed by some local authority, it's hard to see this as anti-fascism instead of, well, a theft of public resources. After all, why was the meadow his? Because he said so? It wasn't like he was leaving the Mugel unlocked. This wasn't a public resource. It was his and his son's. They'd built it, and so naturally, in their eyes, it was their private property. Or as he'd frame it, anarchy. But the local government disagreed. In a realer sense, a legal sense, the land much more literally belonged to them. So, within a few months of it being erected, the local council sued the artist and demanded that the Mugel be removed. Which, of course, he refused. As a burgeoning, I suppose the modern term is sovereign citizen, Edward Lippberger was not about to play some lawyer's game. What anarchist accepts the authority of the state? This was art. And art is bound by no human law, so Herr Lippberger settled on a different course of action. He declared his Kugelmugel the town of Kugelmugel. And in that town, he would be the sole authority. Not quite mayor, per se, more a dictator. He'd even go so far as to install barbed wire just to keep everyone else out. And yet, for some crazy reason, again, that local council disagreed. So he stepped it up a notch. If they were suing him as Austrians, then he'd declare his town was no longer part of Austria. It was a nation unto itself. The town of Kugelmugel would become the Republic of Kugelmugel. He'd create stamps, currency, and of course, stop paying his taxes. Which, as you might imagine, was a step too far. You can do a lot of things in life, but one thing you can never do is stop paying taxes. Well, most of us, anyway. So after many years of trying to solve their problem through nonviolent means, that local authority finally had enough, and in 1979, they arrested that dictator of anarchy. He'd be sent to jail for tax evasion and the lesser charge of putting up illegal road signs, but there he'd find a loophole called fame. And after 10 weeks behind bars, he'd be pardoned by the President of Austria himself. Another group of artists had declared their own extremely cleverly named republic Artopia, and since nobody had arrested them, it didn't seem fair that Lippberger be the only one punished. Plus, he was becoming kind of a folk hero. As is often the case with acts of long-term public disobedience, the more pressure applied against him, the more that Kugelmugel grew in popularity. The more press it received, the more this small sphere of defiance changed from one man's art studio into a symbol seen as more important than the laws it broke to create it. Anarchismus. By 1982, 10 years after it was first built, the fame of that art had long outpaced the annoyance of dealing with the artist, and the mayor of Vienna proposed a solution. He was himself, I suppose, anti-fascist, going so far as to work with the Soviet secret police as a communist informant. He'd even lose his left hand to a far-right extremist the press deemed the Austrian Unabomber. Not a huge part of this story, but I thought it was interesting enough to include. It was through that half-handed mayor that a local amusement park in downtown Vienna was convinced of the economic value of hosting the Kugelmugel. If tourists ever wanted to see the Republic, well, they'd have to go through the fairgrounds. And so, calling it asylum, that sphere would be moved to the Austrian capital and placed in its own self-declared anti-fascism square. For a brief period, it was then provided with free water, electricity, and sewage services from the city that surrounded it. But upon realizing that its owners remained very serious about it staying a foreign republic, they were all eventually cut. Because if it wasn't Austria, then why was Austria paying for it? What type of anarchist relies on a government to survive? And so, without support from the park around it, the Republic faced an all-too-familiar challenge. It was built without a permit, and this was still Austria. But, rather amusingly, now with the law on his side, that self-declared anarchist decided to play the lawyer's game. His case even went all the way to the Supreme Court, and eventually the city would give in and legally declare the sphere a building without a permit, offering to fund the services it required to keep pretending to be an independent state. By the time its creator died in 2015, the Republic of Kugelmugel had firmly settled into its new home, treated as a permanent attraction within the park that surrounds it. But true to its origins, it never quite integrated into that park. Although it would exist within it, it would not be part of it. Although it would exist within the country, it would never be truly part of that country either. The dictatorship of that proclaimed republic would be handed down through bloodline. And through the divine right of its king, that heir apparent would hire a president to manage the nation he'd never actually lived in. But sarcasm aside, as silly as this sounds, I do for one hope that this tiny circular Reich lasts 1,000 years. Because to me, at least, it speaks to a deeper truth, something far more important than that artist ever intended it to. It says, quite clearly, anarchy doesn't make sense. It only ever works when it can live off the services provided by another stable community. It's upheld by ideologues who want to use our space, but surround theirs in barbed wire. The Republic of Kugelmugel only survives because its 600 citizens live in other countries, because Austria gives it free electricity. It produces nothing but ideology, and without the rest of us to prop it up, it dies. Anarchy doesn't work. And yet, no matter how evident that truth, no matter how obvious this symbol makes that clear to many people living in their own bubbles of ideology, if you ever disagree with that, you're a fascist. Possibly even an Austrian. This is Rare Earth.